Yo, I'm Gadin and I'm making a game solo, and this month has been entirely focused on combat. Over the past year, I spent most of my time building the foundation for the combat system. The Spirit Companion, the combo branching, and hit juggles, all of these mechanics had to exist before I could really start making the combat fun. This month, I've aimed to add content and, more importantly, try to transform what was essentially a combat prototype into something that actually feels fun to play. My initial goal was to create new attacks and polish the animations, but after working on it for the past few weeks, I realized that actually it won't be my main focus. The most time-consuming part turned out to be finding the right rhythm, making every attack naturally flow into the next, giving each combo a purpose, and making sure the combat encourages players to make interesting decisions instead of simply mashing buttons. Also, this month reminded me of a lesson I've learned several times throughout this project. If I don't want to block my creative flow, sometimes I need to force myself to work in a messy way. Most of the attack animation you've seen in the game so far aren't meant to be final. I actually created them quite a while ago, when I was only trying to build the foundation of the combat system. At that point, I wasn't designing the final gameplay yet. I simply needed enough attacks to prototype mechanics and experiment with ideas. Those animations were mainly there to establish the visual style and give me something to build the combat around. Back then, mechanics like juggling, combo routing, no-backs, and even the Spirit Companion either didn't exist yet or were not fully implemented. All I needed was a handful of attacks that could capture the feeling I was aiming for. I wasn't thinking much about timing, rhythm, or how each move would fit into a complete combat system. You could see that as work that eventually gets thrown away, but those animations did exactly what they were supposed to do. They gave me the building blocks I needed to create the combat system. Now that most of these systems are finally in place, I can come back to those old animations with a much clearer understanding of what each attack is actually meant to accomplish. Now that the core mechanics are in place, I'm working on the attack animation in a different way. Before, my only priority was to make the animation look good. Now I also need to ask myself, what purpose does this attack serve? Should it be just about raw damages? Should it be a launcher? Should it encourage the player to use the spirit to extend a combo? Should it push enemies away when you're surrounded? Or should it close the distance against ranged enemies? Or maybe it helps to get the distance at the end of the combo? I think that's one of the biggest differences between creating animations and designing combat. A cool looking attack doesn't automatically make combat interesting, and every attack should encourage a different decision from the player. The more combo routes with a different purpose I can create, the less repetitive the combat becomes, and that's really the direction I'm trying to push the system towards. Once every attack has a purpose, the next challenge is figuring out when each attack should happen, and that's where timing becomes incredibly important. Let's take juggling as an example. Imagine you've launched an enemy into the air. If your next attack takes too long to start, the enemy might hit the ground before the attack connects. The juggle is over and your combo ends. Most action games will simply try to avoid that, but in SILKROAD Project I'm actually trying to use that as part of the combat design. One of my goals is to encourage players to actively use the spirit during their combos. So in my situations, I intentionally want there to be a small gap between the two hero attacks. If the player recognizes that rhythm, they can insert a spirit attack in between and keep the enemy airborne just long enough to continue the combo. Players who simply mash buttons will still be able to play the games without too much trouble, but players who learn the rhythm of their own combos will naturally get rewarded with longer and more satisfying sequences. And I think that's an important distinction. A good combat system isn't just about cool animations, it's also about rhythm and tempo. And it's giving players an incentive to master the flow of the combat by rewarding deliberate, well-timed actions. If you are looking at the new combat animation I've implemented this month, you may be wondering something. The new animations actually look a lot worse than the older ones. And yes, that was actually intentional. The priority this month wasn't animation quality, it was finding the right combat rhythm. That meant constantly going back and tweaking timings, moving a few keyframes here because an attack started too slowly, or shortening the recovery there because the combo no longer flowed properly, then playing the game again to see how it felt. I knew that if I spent days polishing every animation, I'd end up wasting a huge amount of time every time I wanted to change something. So instead, I kept everything as simple as possible. Most of these attacks are made with very basic poses and only the minimum number of keyframes needed to communicate the movement. They are not meant to look impressive yet, they are just accurate enough to me to judge whether the gameplay feels right. Once I'm confident that every attack has the correct timing, then I come back and polish them. To be honest, that's one of the hardest things to me, to restrain myself to make things look good and accept that it just needs the bare minimum amount of work while prototyping things. Ironically, after spending an entire month trying to improve the combat, I think I actually made it less exciting. One of my goals was to make the spirit feel more integrated into the combat system. To do that, I started slowing down certain attacks so players would naturally have enough time to weave a spirit attack between two hero attacks. From a gameplay perspective, it worked. There are more opportunities to extend juggles and the interaction between both characters become much clearer. But after taking a step back and simply playing the game for a while, I realized something felt off. The combat had lost part of its intensity. By slowing down attacks to create more decision making, I also removed some of the speed and the aggression that originally made the combat feel satisfying. That's always the tricky part when balancing a combat system. A change can make the mechanics objectively better, while making the overall feeling worse. So I think I will have to go back to the drawing board and revisit those timing once again. Thankfully, because almost everything is still a placeholder, I don't feel bad making drastic changes. I can throw away ideas, rebuild combo routes and completely rethink attacks without feeling like I've wasted weeks polishing some things that no longer fit the game. While I was revisiting all those attacks, I also spent a lot of time thinking about the overall combo structure. Until now, I only had a single combo chain that was mostly there to support the prototype. Now I'm building all the different branches the combat system will eventually support. Things like light heavy attacks or light heavy attacks, and every variation in between. But the important part isn't simply giving the player more combos. It's making sure each branch has a purpose. Some combo routes are long and deal a lot of damage, but they leave you vulnerable if the enemy manages to escape. Others travel a long distance and work as a gap closers against enemies trying to keep their distance. Some end with a step back, allowing you to safely disengage after attacking. Others launch enemies into the air and naturally become combo starters. And some are designed to knock enemies away, giving you breathing room when you are surrounded. The more situations I can create where each combo route solves a different problem, the more interesting the combat becomes. While expanding the combo system, I've also introduced something I've wanted to experiment with for a while: charge attacks. I think they fit very well with the philosophy I'm trying to build for SILKROAD Project. The combat isn't really about pressing buttons as fast as possible, it's about understanding the rhythm of your attacks and recognizing the right moments to commit a stronger move. So now some combo branches can end with a charge heavy attacks. If that attack lands, it immediately transitions into a devastating sequence of rapid strikes, and I really like the pacing it creates. It now gives a very good incentive for the player to use the spirit at the right moment, with the right timing to keep the enemy stunned while the hero charges his powerful attack. It also adds depth to the combat systems and encourages players to master the game even more. The charged attacks also gave me the perfect opportunity to introduce something I was eager to work on: cinematics finishers. The idea is pretty simple. If a charged attack hits an enemy normally, you get powerful follow-up attack. But if that same charge attacks connect while the enemy is still being juggled, then something completely different happens. For just a few seconds, the game briefly takes control of the camera and transitions into a fully animated finisher. It's still part of the gameplay, but it's designed to feel like one of those over-the-top anime moments where the hero shows off in a flashy sequence. And from a gameplay perspective, I like that it rewards players for mastering the combat. For now, you don't get these finishers by pressing a dedicated button, you get them because you successfully managed your combo, kept the enemy airborne, and committed to the right attack at exactly the right moment. For the upcoming demo, I've finished 3 different finishers, and I think that's probably enough variety for now. They are short, flashy, and hopefully satisfying enough that players will actively try to trigger them instead of seeing them as a scripted event. I had a lot of fun working on this cinematic action finisher. Unlike the regular gameplay attacks, these animations aren't placeholders. Since they are cinematic sequences, I had far fewer gameplay constraints to worry about. I wasn't constantly adjusting timings to make combo routes work, so I could finally spend time polishing the animation itself. And honestly, I really enjoyed it. It felt good to slow down for a moment and simply focus on making something look as dynamic and expressive as I possibly could. Looking back at them now, I genuinely feel like they are some of the best animation I've made for the project so far. Actually, it's when I was done working on those animations without constraints that I realized, while getting back to animating normal gameplay attacks, that something wasn't right. After spending days polishing these flashy cinematic sequences, my regular combat suddenly felt much less energetic, especially in comparison. Working on flashy and very fast animation made me realize that for the kind of anime-inspired combats I'm aiming for, strong poses and rhythm are probably more important than perfectly smooth motions. Sometimes an attack doesn't need too much animation. It simply needs great timing and strong key poses. Creating these finishers was definitely one of the most enjoyable things I worked on this month, but its implementation into the game turned out to be much more complex than I expected. The real challenge was making those cinematics work anywhere in the game. Unlike a traditional cutscene, these finishers can start almost everywhere. Sometimes you are standing in the middle of an open field, sometimes you are fighting next to a wall, or sometimes there is a rock, a tree, or an obstacle right beside you. And as an animator, I have absolutely no control over any of that. So suddenly, every animation had to work regardless of the environment. And I had to be more cautious and take a bit more time to think thoroughly of how I can avoid gameplay issues. At first, I just made really flashy animations without worrying about the distance the character travels. It looked great, but it quickly raised very obvious questions. What happens if there's a wall right in the middle of the animation? How should the character behave in this situation? Well, either the character goes straight through the wall or they collide with it. Neither option is great. If they ignore collisions, when the cinematic ends, the player and the enemy can end up standing inside a wall. But if they keep collisions enabled, then things can become unpredictable. Imagine one character gets blocked by a small rock while the other one continues following its animation. The entire sequence immediately falls apart. And that's just for the character, but what should the camera do? Should it also stay attached to the player? Because if the player gets stuck, the camera gets stuck too. And suddenly your cinematics looks terrible. At that point, I realized I wasn't looking for a perfect solution anymore. I was looking for the least problematic compromise. After trying several different approaches for my cinematic actions in my game, I eventually accepted that I wasn't going to be able to do everything I wanted. And honestly, I think that's fine. Because sometimes creativity comes from constraints. So I changed my approach entirely. Instead of creating huge cinematic attacks that travel across the battlefield, I now try to design finishers where both characters stay relatively close to where they started, and collisions are temporarily disabled during the sequence, which means, yes, sometimes characters will clip through walls or briefly float above the ground, but that's a compromise I'm willing to accept. What matters is that once the animation ends, both characters are placed exactly where they were before the cinematic started. From a gameplay perspective, that solves a huge number of problems. Enemies won't accidentally end up behind obstacles, players won't trigger events they weren't supposed to reach, and because I know exactly where the characters will end up, I can also use the camera angles to hide some of these little tricks from the player. At the end of the day, I think that's a good example of something important when doing game dev. Perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes the best solution is simply the one that creates the fewest problems. So that's pretty much what I've been working on this month. Even though I added a lot of new content, I think the biggest progress wasn't actually visible. It was understanding the combat system a little better and figuring out what still isn't working. The combat is still not where I want it to be, the timing needs more work, some attacks need to become much more dynamic, and I still have a lot of iteration ahead of me before I'm happy with the overall game feel. But that was expected. I knew that balancing a feature can sometimes take even more time than implementing it. So next month, I'll probably keep iterating on everything you've seen today. Hopefully with a little bit more speed and a little bit more impact, and a combat systems that feels even closer to the vision I've had in mind from the very beginning. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next devlog.